Okay, so good evening, everyone, and welcome to this talk on parenting, part of our COVID-19 health series. I'd firstly like to thank Michelle Sint, who put together this series, and also to thank Talia Masha, who instigated the arrangement of this session in particular, and connecting us with our speaker for the evening. I'm going to hand over in just a moment to Sheryl. But first, I just want to welcome you, first of all, Sheryl, to our community, to know Israel over Zoom. We really appreciate you giving of your time and look forward to learning from you and from your expertise and any tips and tricks that you can suggest to us for parenting in general and specifically in these unusual and, should I say, intense times. Many of you will be familiar with Chazal's advice of smol doicher v'min miskareves, that to parent in a manner that pushes away with the left hand and draws close with the right or the stronger hand. And in other words, we could say that the aim is to provide an overarching atmosphere of a strong, loving, warm, safe relationship for a child, but with clear boundaries set to balance love with limits and structure. And the problem arises when our solid foundation, the floor that we're standing on, is shaken up and becomes hard for us to keep our balance. So this is what has happened to us recently. Our normal structure, our routines, and even our social support has been disrupted. So I still implore you to remember that certainly for young children, more important than keeping up with their schoolwork, what is important is maintaining a happy home, a good family relationship. So I'm pleased to welcome Sheryl, who is going to offer some practical advice about maintaining such a happy balance. In terms of the structure of the evening, Sheryl's going to speak first, and then we'll leave some time for questions at the end. So if you have any questions, if you think of any while she's speaking, either make a note for yourself or and write them down, or so that you can ask them yourself in person at the end, or you can use the chat and send them either to Sheryl or to myself, and we'll address Sheryl will address them at the end. For those of you who don't know Sheryl Cohen, she's an educational psychologist with 26 years of experience working with children, adolescents, and parents. Sheryl is the chair of a therapy center for children with 14 therapists from 5 different disciplines, and was the director of an abuse prevention organization, and is a mother of 4 children as well. So Sheryl, I hand over to you.
Thank you so much. And it's really a privilege to share this platform and to have the opportunity to share some ideas in coping with the change and the challenge that we've all been experiencing over the last couple of weeks and months, and continue to face in the next couple of weeks and months. And Oliver, you've mentioned something, such a significant word of disruption. And I think that that is very much a part of our experience, not only as adults, but as children as well. And my aim tonight is to give you some practical tips to help you to parent effectively, to walk this journey, which has been disruptive and disrupted, in a way that gives you empowerment to gain mastery and control over the job called parenting. Often we kind of assume that love is enough to raise children, but it really isn't. We all need skills. In fact, there's an interesting quote, a humorous quote, and his name is Michael Levine. He says, having children makes you no more a parent than having a piano makes you a pianist. And I thought that that was a kind of just a humorous way to begin and to introduce this topic. We all need skills, and I'm sure that's what brings you onto this platform. And I want to also say that there's no such thing as perfect parents. And in this particular area, it's very hard to call oneself an expert. Thank you for the lovely introduction. However, we are all learning as we go. As you've noticed, these are unprecedented times that require quite a significant amount of thinking and replanning and rethinking and then replanning. And therefore, I think it's wiped away our idea of what it means to be an expert and what it means to be a perfect parent. So I prefer the model of what Dr. Donald Winnicott calls a good enough parent. If our aim can be good enough rather than be perfect, then I think we're giving our children a model to be good enough children rather than to be perfect children as well. So that's really the premise from which I'd like to launch this particular discussion, which is parenting in Siberia. So I hope to give you some practical things in mind. So with all of this in mind, let's look at the next particular slide. Oops. Okay, let's just get that. Oh, don't know why that, oh, there we go. Okay, sorry about that. Don't know why it's not going. Okay, there we go. So this slide is a nice place to start, where I'd like to say, what is your temperature in Siberia? How do you feel right now? How are you feeling about the experiences we've had up until now? How are you experiencing with the challenges we face from now? And the reason I'm not expecting an answer in this particular point of the discussion, but we certainly can have more interaction towards the end. But I like to start with this particular question more than the answer, because I think a good place to deal with our
Sheryl,
children. Yes.
I think you're somehow muted. I don't know if it's just me, but the volume has gone completely off as soon as you shared screen.
Okay, can you hear me now? No? Can you hear me now?
You can hear? Okay, so it's just me.
Okay, can you hear me now? Okay, so my question is that let's take our temperature in Siberia, the strange, unfamiliar environment that we all find ourselves in. And why I ask the question, it's not that I'm expecting an answer, perhaps it's something you can answer for yourself, is just because I think we need to often orientate ourselves in terms of how where are our emotions lying? How do we feel about where we are at this point in time? And my experience is that if we can deal with some of the things that we feel, then we are able to connect to some of the things that our children feel as well. So that strategy is one that I hold strongly by, and that will underpin this particular presentation, in that we'll talk about our feelings, and in the same way we'll be able to transfer that into giving it over and understanding our children's feelings. So moving to the next question, how do you feel when you see that picture? How does it make you feel? So this is what some of the clients I have over the last couple of weeks have said to me. A little girl, Sarah, she's 4 years old. When she looks at that particular picture, she says to me, she feels really hot. Then there's Adam, who said that when he looks at that picture, he feels really scared because his aunt's a nurse and he doesn't want anything horrible to happen to her. And then, of course, there's Jake, whose dad's a doctor, and he's also worried, more anxious than sad, because he's worried that his dad will catch coronavirus and will bring it home. And so that evokes that feeling inside of him. So what resonates with us as adults of these feelings often are the same, similar. What resonates for children often resonates with us as well. Okay, let's look at the next slide. How does that make you feel? Just take a minute to kind of think of it in your own mind. How do you feel when you look at that picture? What feelings are evoked inside of you? So I'll share with you a couple of comments that were made on a teacher training program that I gave last week. There was one teacher, Sue, and she said the first thing or thought that came to mind was, this belongs to another life. She can't imagine going back to this particular life. So her feeling was very much around shock. Then there was Lana. She said her feeling immediately this picture evokes is avoidance. She wants to run away. She just can't think about being in this kind of environment. Then, of course, there's Mark, who kind of feels frozen and unable to move or unable to even digest the information of all these people in such close proximity to each other, and almost feels like, I don't want to touch this picture, I don't want to touch anything, and I don't want anybody to touch me. So it's very much a frozen kind of response. And then, of course, there was another person, and I've changed the names here, but we'll call her Sheryl, and she says that when she looks at this picture, it gives her a tremendous amount of hope that we're going to get back to something like this as soon as there's a vaccination and the world goes back to normal. So here we see that there are 4 different responses that people have had in terms of just a visual exposure to this, or to our world that we're experiencing. And we can maybe classify it in terms of the 4 different responses that we all have towards trauma. So that would be fight, flight, freeze, the 3 different ones: fight, flight, or freeze. And so there's that feeling of, I just want to get away from here, that avoidance that we spoke, that somebody's had as a response. Then there's the freeze of, don't touch anything, don't touch me, I'm not interested. And the fight also could be a kind of a run, flight, and fight could also be like, get away from me, I'm not interested, don't touch me. And freeze is not being able to do anything. So these are different responses. And what I want to really share with you is 2 things. The one is that there's no prescription on how to respond to difficult experiences, and that actually there's no right or wrong way. It evokes a response that we have to be able to accept, that we have to be able to tolerate some of the difficult feelings that are evoked in us in dealing with all the challenges that we face around us, whether it's challenges of the past, such as lockdown, or challenges of the future, such as sending our children and taking our children to school. We have to be able to contain and hold a bunch of really difficult feelings. But if we are able to hold and contain some of those feelings, then hopefully we'll be able to contain and hold some of the feelings of our children. This is what Bion calls, Wilfred Bion, a forefather of psychology, reverie. It's a bit like tennis. You know, if you watch tennis, Wimbledon, I'm sure you all have, then you notice that there's somebody on the other side of the court who's waiting for the ball, but hasn't received it yet, but they're totally waiting for it. And they're in position and they're ready. And that's, I feel, like a nice metaphor to understand some of the job that we call parenting, some of the role that we take, where we're standing and waiting to hold the projection of our children's difficult feelings in order to understand it, sometimes to make sense of it, and then sometimes to give it back to our children in very digestible, meaningful, and understandable ways. So this is one of the important practical tips that I think we need to keep in mind. Of course, it's very difficult because often when we're standing in that position of reverie, waiting for our children's difficult feelings, we often have a lot of difficult feelings of our own. And that's hard because it's hard to process our own feelings while at the same time processing our children's feelings. But if we can be conscious of that and be able to hold our own feelings, sometimes put them aside a little or on pause for a bit, and then hold and make sense of our children's feelings, I think we are setting ourselves up for a very effective model for connection and for good attachment. And I think that this is an important task. So I think what we've been through is not something I'm going to focus on, but I've called it, and I've heard it called, a corona coaster. We've been on a corona coaster where we've had lots and lots of challenges of trying to be flexible, having to be flexible, about sometimes being in that position of reverie and then sometimes being in the position of having to serve and then being in reverie again and then serving again. So I think that we need to also put into our model of effective parenting an element of flexibility. And I think that it's not a bad thing that children see that we are human, that we make mistakes, because if children can see that we make mistakes, that we are sometimes struggle or challenged by flexibility or the need to be flexible, then hopefully children will develop that skill in themselves too. So it very much upholds what your Rebbitzin is saying, in that we have to sometimes work on ourselves in order to assist with our children's emotional well-being. But it doesn't stop there. There are a lot more skills and strategies we need to learn. And this is the one I'd like to share with you first, the first set of practical tips and skills. Think about some of the gains and losses for you in this new world called Siberia. What are the gains and what are the losses? Now, gains and losses are always the experience of change. There are a bunch of gains and there are a bunch of losses. So let's take an example, children going back to school. both in England and in South Africa, our children are starting to go back to school. What are the gains for going back to school? Are they possibly the gains of getting educated on a school campus? A huge gain that I've noticed in my practice over the last week or so is the social element that children are missing and really want to see their friends, even if they can't touch them and be close to them. They want to be back in a classroom environment. In fact, I would say, go so far as saying that there's been an experience of social deprivation over the last couple of weeks and months. So this is a huge gain for children. What is the gain for you? Perhaps the gain for you is that you might get some sense of time to finish a hot cup of tea, especially if you've got preschoolers. You might be able to get some time to take things a little bit slower. And then, of course, there might be some losses. What would the loss for you be? It might be the loss of kind of maybe being in a bubble and being able to protect and physically keep your children safe. Now you have to let them go and expose them to a world that doesn't always feel so safe. There might be the loss of possibly time. Maybe now you have to get up and get the children ready, or one child, I suppose it's going back in grades and phases, get a child ready for school. So you have to get everybody ready. And so your leisurely morning might be challenged or a bit more rushed in order to meet the demands. So there are gains and there are losses. There are other parents who have shared with me that some of the losses that they'll experience is the very small growth points that they've seen in their children because they've spent so much more time with them. But then, of course, there's also the loss of now having to make school lunch. And I'm not sure how it is in the UK, but in South Africa, we send our children to school. So now parents have to kind of get that all done and ready the night before. So there are gains and losses in every experience of change. So that's what I was thinking about in terms of a practical tip. How does it apply? So let's look at not only gains and losses for you, but what would the gains and losses for your children be as well? And my thinking is that if we can edit the experience with both gains and losses, then we help our children to come to terms with the challenge and the change that they are facing. So it would be a very helpful practical tip to say to your first grader or year one, to say, what do you think the good things are about going back to school? And what do you think the things are going to be that you miss about going back to school? And what are the things you gain? What are the gains about being home, and what are the losses about being home? So if we can get a balanced perspective, then we are helping our children to edit the experience with both positive and negatives. And that's very important. For children, especially preschool children, they are born with an automatic splitting defense mechanism. This is how they cope with difficult feelings. So when you as a mom or a dad come to a child with a bottle or a breast full of milk, you are a fairy prince or a fairy princess. You are unbelievable. But when you don't, and you take a long time to bring the milk, or you take a long time to do something that your child asks you to do or demands of you to do, then you're a wicked witch or a wicked wizard, and they don't like it. So they tend to split into good and bad, right and wrong. And that's why fairy tales are actually so popular, because there's always a fairy godmother and then there's the baddies. And that kind of is the way in which children split or defend against dealing with their difficult internal feelings or internal world. We learn this from a very famous psychologist, a psychoanalyst called Bruno Bettelheim. He's actually an Italian Holocaust survivor, and he writes very prolifically about fairy tales and understanding their inner meaning. And however, just to move on from that, is that as children grow and develop, we don't want them to stay in that state of splitting. We've all seen adults who behave that way, where if you do what they want, you're their best friend, and if you don't, then they'll have nothing to do with you. Or if you they have a meal at a restaurant and it's lovely and delicious, then they'll go back. And if they don't, they're never going back ever again, despite the fact that maybe it was just a one-off day. So I think what we are really saying is that as we grow into adulthood and we encourage our children to do the same, we need to encourage the defense or the management, the coping mechanism of integration away from splitting. In other words, we want our children to see that mommy is a wicked witch and a fairy godmother in the same person. This will help them to be able to tolerate and to integrate the good and the bad inside of them. So we have to be able to go for integration and not to encourage splitting, because splitting is an unhealthy defense mechanism that children often use, but we don't want to encourage. So we want to be able to help our children to integrate the losses and the gains of every experience, and in that way to develop a more holistic, integrated sense of understanding and sense of self. Okay, so one of the greatest gains over here is, of course, social engagement. And as I said, I think children have been socially deprived over the last few weeks, and children really do learn from other children. It's something that encourages them. It builds lots of skills. So I think that that's one of the gains. Okay, and as I said, we also want our children to have a sense of balance between the two. Okay. Now, what I wanted to share also is that loss and gain is not really new to children. In fact, if we see it in their development, we can see that this has been the case right from gestation. When babies were in utero, all their needs were met before they even knew they had any. They could eat, they could urinate, they could defecate, they were kept warm, they were held. Everything was done for them. The birth experience is a tremendous loss. It's a loss for you as a parent, because now you have to assess, is the child hungry, wet, tired, cold, sick? What does my baby need from me? And the baby is also loss for the baby, because now the baby has to communicate through different cries, or the same cry, but the wish that mommy or daddy will be able to provide for his needs when he can't communicate them beyond a cry. So that's a loss. But at the same time, there's a gain. For you, there's a gain that you see your baby, please God, 10 fingers, 10 toes, that you also see that your baby is healthy, and that also we know that the uterus would become toxic if a baby was not born, if it was born any longer than 40 weeks. So there are losses and there are gains in the birth experience. For you as a mom, you might notice that there's a tremendous gain in that you've given birth to this baby, but there's a loss because you can't really fit into the clothes that you used to wear. So these losses and gains are part and parcel for parent and for child in growing up. Let's take another simple few examples. Your baby's first tooth, tremendous gain, because now your baby can possibly chew on a few things, but there's a loss because it's sore. Then also there might be a gain in the first step, because now before your baby took his or her first step, you could kind of keep a few delicate objects at eye level. Now you can't, because your baby can reach and touch things, and now you have to put them all away. So there's a gain and a loss for you. Also gain to see your baby grow and develop, which is a lovely experience. And so it goes on. First day of school, perhaps a child's first period, perhaps high school. Oh, I'm about to sneeze. All those things are losses and gains. So I think that you get the picture about that. So our aim is really to have a balance between the two. Okay, so how do we do this? So here's my tip on dealing with the losses and the gains. So we have to edit the experience of change, keeping them both in mind. Now we're moving to tip 2, and this comes with how do we deal with our children's difficult feelings? Because in losses, and I suppose regardless of where they are, children really do have lots of difficult feelings. We as adults have difficult feelings. And I sometimes think or wonder that if Hashem could create such a complicated reflex, such as sucking, for a small newborn baby without one lesson, or the capacity to learn language without one lesson, how is it that our children are not born civilized and socialized? Why is it that we have to do that for them? And maybe that's because whatever we see in our children is something that we often have to fix up in ourselves. So that's just a side advert. So just to keep that in mind. But I think that difficult feelings are something that we have to deal with and our children have to deal with. How do we deal with children's difficult feelings? So just to rewind a bit, how do children usually express their difficult feelings? It usually manifests in quite physical ways: kicking, hitting, shouting, crying, lying, stealing, all those kind of things, that sibling rivalry, all the things that we don't really like and want to socialize and civilize our children out of. So what is the model for dealing with our children's difficult feelings? So I've put together a acronym for you, a nice packaged little word that says the art of parenting, that you can use in order to assist with your children's difficult feelings and your own, of course. So the first is A, and that is to acknowledge your child's difficult feelings. So to be able to step into their world, to step out of your world, out of Sheryl's world, and into her child's world, Sam's world, and to say, Sam, I can see you're really angry. So to actually step into that world, to then reflect his wish, and that might be, I can see you really wish you didn't have to get off or stop with the iPad, stop using, watching a movie or playing on the iPad, playing Roblox or whatever it might be, and then take action. Either you can choose, Sam, to put the iPad down, or I'll take it down, I'll take it from you. You can choose. Or you can either choose 5 more minutes and then put it down, whatever the choice might be. I mean, I'm just giving an example here. But I think that the aim of really the skill is to be able to step into your child's world, acknowledge their feeling, reflect their wish, and that also stays in their world, and then to step out and into your world and take action. So let me give you another example, perhaps a better example. Step into the world, let's say, into your child's world. Let's say your child does not want to get out of the bath. Your toddler is enjoying the bath, doesn't want to get out. So you might say, Dina, I can see that you are loving the bath. This is the best fun. You're having a great time. You really wish you could stay in the bath and play all much longer because it's so much fun. So you're stepping into your child's world and then you step out. But bath time is finished. Either you can hop out the bath and choose a towel, choose a color towel that you'd like to use, or mommy's going to take you out and then I'll choose for you. You decide. So the choice over here is being able to put the ball in your child's court and letting them decide within well-defined parameters. So you don't necessarily say the choice is you get in the bath or you stay in the bath, because that's not a choice. Mommy wants you out the bath. Mommy can't watch you any longer. It's time to get out the bath. So you put that in place. It's bath time is over. Either you choose to get out on your own and choose the towel, so there's a bit of a positive reinforcer in that process, or I'll take you out anyway, and then you give up the chance to choose. It's up to you. So this really is about stepping into the child's world and then stepping into your world. And the reason why we do this is because it's much better to start with the emotional stuff than it is to start with the behavioral stuff. In other words, if your child doesn't get out the bath and you kind of standing over there commanding and saying, get out the bath this minute, it's enough already. How many times I tell you to get out the bath? Or get off your iPad. How many times does I tell you? What you're doing is you're focusing on the action. And this is not a behavioral issue, and it's not a cognitive issue. So you might hear yourself saying, how many times, you're not supposed to be on the iPad after 5 o'clock, or you're not, that there's no more, whatever it is. So you kind of might think that it's useful to say, but actually this is not a cognitive issue. It's not intellectual. Children know a lot. And it's not behavioral. They know what they have to do too, and they can do it. It's emotional. And that's why I like to start with the art of parenting, because it gives children the feeling of being understood. It's a bit like if, let's say, you forgot to fetch something from the shops, and now you have to go all the way back because, let's say, it was yeast, and there's no way you can make challah if you're really intending to without going to get the yeast. And now you tell your spouse about it, and your spouse says, well, you needed the yeast. Why didn't you get it? Or, how many times I have to tell you that, you should have a shopping list? So all those things that are cognitive or behavioral are not very comforting to start off with. It would be much more helpful and far more effective if your spouse said to you, oh, what a well, how annoying, how irritating. I really understand how annoying and frustrating it is when you've just come back that you have to go again. What about if next time you use a shopping list? So in other words, if your spouse would take action or suggest a solution, but before that, preface it by acknowledging your feelings, it would be much easier to digest. And I bring that example of an adult, of us as parents, because I think if we understand what it feels like to be understood, then we are able to give our children that opportunity too. So, art of parenting is tip number 2. In fact, I feel that it fits in very nicely with an understanding of a model, an effective model between parent and child. So over here, you can see that there's 2 circles, the one being the child and the other being a parent. Now, theoretically, or you can think back of when your child was little, when the younger the child, the more space they take up in this relationship. So then the shaded in area of green will be very big. For example, if you have a 4-month-old, or a 3-month-old, or even a 6-month-old. Let's say you've decided you and your spouse are going to sit down to a nice dinner tonight and you've got everything ready. You've bathed the baby early. You've fed everybody. Everybody's in bed. It all looks good. And what happens? The baby vomits. She needs another change and she needs another bath. So then your dinner arrangements are gone. You have to give up on them. And that is understandable, and you'll do it. And you'll do it with a smile on your face, and you might even do it happily. Well, but yes, you'll do it happily and you'll accept that that's what it is. Fast forward and your child is 3 years, 6 months, and you might not do it so happily. Fast forward even further and your child is 10 years, 6 months, you will not do it happily. So I think that what we notice is that the circle between parent and child tends to separate, never completely, because you're always going to have that area of overlap, that relationship in between, which we call the transitional space. And actually, interesting to note, that transitional objects are often placed in that transitional space, like, for example, a dummy, a bottle, or a blankie. That is what children use in order to make the transition from being, for example, asleep to being awake, or being awake to being asleep. They use that object as a way of self-soothing. We call it the child's first internally owned object. In other words, as they grow and develop, they realize they don't have control over mommy and daddy anymore. If they say, mommy, sit, mommy doesn't sit. She moves around. But if they take their dummy or their bunny or their blanket and they put it down and they make it sit, it sits. So that's why we call it the child's first transitional, internally owned object that they have complete control over. And it acts a bit like children's Prozac, a bit like children's way of self-soothing, and it's very healthy. There was a study that was done that looked at the relationship between children and their transitional object. The assumption was that if a parent lost his or her life, then the child would become more dependent on the object because it was a crutch. Actually, just the opposite occurred, that when a parent lost his or her life, the child's interest in the object, the transitional object, was lost. So what we see is that this object mirrors the parent relationship. It becomes the internal introject of what the child holds on to in their own inside world. So we mustn't let them go too fast. They are to be encouraged. Obviously, it has other boundaries, and that's what we're really talking about now. So just to recap for 1 minute, at the beginning of this talk, we spoke about the losses and gains, and I think that related to parenting in Siberia. Now we're talking about things like dealing with children's difficult feelings. Both, we could say, in this parenting Siberia environment, but they're also ordinary environments. And now what we're moving on is to the third part of our discussion, which is boundaries. And what you can see here is that there's a line in the circles between parent and child. In other words, there's a boundary of the child circle so that it doesn't overtake the whole of the parent circle. And likewise, there's a boundary of the parent circle so that it shouldn't overtake the whole of the child side. And what I notice in my work as a therapist, and as I've ever said, I've been working for 27 years, is that when children take over too much of the parental space, then parents begin to feel like they work for their children, and they begin to feel enslaved by their children. And interestingly, children then begin to feel quite entitled. In fact, I can't say that this experience escaped me. I remember when my son, Sam, who's now 23, but he was just a little boy of about 4, he said to me, "Ma, what did you used to do before you worked for us?" And we all laughed at home because in his mind, I really was working for the children. So, so I think that we need to get the balance right here again. Otherwise, we end up with enslaved parents and entitled children, or what some people call spoiled brats. But I don't think that this happens by itself. And I don't think any parent wakes up in the morning and says, "Today I want to raise a spoiled brat. Today I want to raise an entitled child." And no child wakes up and says, "Today I want to take advantage of my parents and I want them to work very hard for me." So how does it happen? And this is where it happens, is when boundaries are not established. And boundaries, I think we all know, are very important. You don't need me to tell you. I think anybody's on this parenting chat or this platform will have been on many platforms before, and you will know that boundaries are important. I would like to just share with you one interesting study that was done on boundaries, and then I'll move on to more practical things about it. So the study was of children on a field, and there were 2 groups. The one group was given a ball and they were told to go and play, and no further rules were given. They found that these children bickered, they couldn't get along, they couldn't get a game going, and they didn't have much fun. The second group of children were given a ball and they were told to go and play, but they were given only one rule, and that was that they weren't allowed to play outside of a demarcated, fenced-in area. And they found that the children got a game going, they made the rules, and they had a lot of fun. And I think what we learned from this experiment is that children need boundaries, even if we don't feel that they do. They themselves do. In fact, I've often watched children play, and I'm fascinated to notice that they can spend 20 minutes making the rules of the game and about 5 minutes playing the game. So I think that they have the sense of the need for boundaries too. So my question is, to take this discussion a little deeper, is we know about boundaries. What undermines our capacity to set them? What stops you from setting boundaries? And maybe you can kind of think about what this relates to inside of your mind. And I'll just share with you some of the things that other parents have shared with me in the therapy sessions that I've had over the years. The one is exhaustion. Parents often struggle to set boundaries because they're just tired. Parenting is tiring. It is tiring. And I think that it's all very well saying, "Oh, well, catch up on your sleep and whatever." But I do think we need to be mindful of what we need as parents in order to have some energy for children in the day and in waking hours. So I think it's very important that sleep is prioritized as parents. Okay, other things that parents have said. Sometimes it's hard to set boundaries because it's just easier to give in. Just easier. It's convenient. It's hard. There's usually not just one child at home. There's a bunch of children, and there's a lot of other commitments. Plus there's work, and there's all the other tasks that we're expected to do, other community commitments, etc. So sometimes it's just easier. But I think we have to look at what the consequences are. Is it really easier in the long run? And what message do we give to our children in that regard? Then, of course, sometimes it feels unknown. Some parents haven't had good examples of what it feels like to have their parents set boundaries for them. So they just feel at a loss of how to go about setting boundaries. And then for other parents, it feels just too harsh. Boundaries feel like a distancing between self and other, between you and your child, that just ends up feeling like it's touching on abandonment. And that is something parents never want to do. But at the same time, then they end up giving in and feeling resentful at the same time. And then, of course, there's another reason that we sometimes struggle to set boundaries, and that could be a birth order issue. Like, for example, it's your 4th child. I can relate to this, and it's like, I'm tired of this. I'm tired of putting children to bed. I just want to go to bed. I don't want to put my 13-year-old to bed. So sometimes it's just about also birth order. So how do we deal with these things? And for this, I think the tip here is just to be conscious of what is the undermining factor. What undermines your capacity to set good boundaries? We all know about the need for them. And if we can be conscious of them, then maybe we can challenge them, and then we can begin to set them in a quite a fair, realistic, and suitable way. My general tip on this particular topic is to be able to be clear about your internal messages and not to give a mixed message. You know, sometimes children say things like, Mom, can you take me to the shops? Or can you take me past a friend to get a puzzle? You know, Shabbos coming and there's no shul and it's locked down and all that. Can we go get a puzzle? And you might say, oh, okay, fine, we'll go get a puzzle. And actually what you're doing is you're giving a mixed message. So you're setting a boundary, but with irritability. And that is very hard for children to take, particularly preschool children. They don't know how to take a mixed message. All they know is that they're irritating you, but they don't know why. So then what happens is that they become anxious and a bit more demanding. And then they cling to you even more because they know they've done something to upset the relationship, the balance in the relationship, but they're not quite sure what it is. So they can end up playing up. So we want to be able to give our children a very clear message. It's good for children to set boundaries. As long as we set the boundaries and we do it fairly and we acknowledge their feelings first, we use the art of parenting, we acknowledge the feelings, reflect the want, and we take action. So in the puzzle example, it might sound like, oh, it would be so nice to have a puzzle. Oh, I can see your point. It really would be nice. And there's really, Shabbos is long. It's really long. I think it's a great idea, but I'm just not going to be able to do it because I'm running out of time for Shabbos. So the answer is no, we won't be going to get the puzzle. But you can choose if you want to ask Dad or if you want to go on Sunday for next Shabbos. So you kind of can give a choice. You can defer to somebody else, whatever it might be. But you first acknowledge feelings, then you reflect the wish, and then you take action. Okay. Let's move on. So let's look at and summarize, and then we'll look at a couple of questions that I've prepared, but we can also look at questions for anybody who has them on this format, in this space. So the 3 top tips for parenting in Siberia is 1, balance the gains and the losses for us and for our children. Number 2, use the art of parenting, acknowledge feelings, reflect the want, and take action. When I first began as a psychologist, I used to run parenting classes. And I remember there was a parent who came, and we actually used to meet once a week for 6 weeks. And at the end of it, I did an evaluation, went around the room, asked everybody, how was it? And the one dad said, look, I can't apply any of this to my child because he's only 1, but it all works perfectly with my wife. So the reason I say that is that these are good communication skills. And sometimes it might seem like I'm talking about preschool and primary school children only, and I am, but I'm also saying that these are good skills to use even with your teenager, even with your spouse, even just out there with your own parents. This is something you could use in your everyday world. And then the third point that we spoke about was boundaries, setting good boundaries, not giving mixed messages, and getting the balance right between the me and the not me, parent and child, so that you're not feeling like your child's taking over your whole space, or you're not feeling that you're taking over your whole space of your child, where they'll end up, by the way, feeling terribly resentful and acting out too. So moving on to some of the questions, anything more you want to know about boundaries, engaging cooperation, setting limits, etc., I'm happy to answer. And you're welcome to send the chat through. But I thought of preparing just 6 questions that have come up over the last few weeks that I'm going to answer. So the first one is, what do I do with my son who refuses to Zoom to school? I'm not sure what you use in the UK, if it's Zoom or Teams or Google Classroom. That's kind of the 3 platforms that are being used here. But I don't think it's about the platform. It's about the fact that sometimes children just don't connect and respond to the style of learning. And my observations is that it's really hard for children to hide. If there are any possible difficulties, like perhaps learning difficulties or attention difficulties or anything like that. And you can't necessarily judge that by only Zoom schooling, but sometimes that's something that we have to just keep an eye open and just be aware of. But of course, in the preschool child, that's irrelevant because they're all like that. In fact, there's an interesting study where they gave a whole bunch of 4-year-olds Ritalin, which is the medication for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and they found that it didn't work because they're all ADHD at that age. So actually, we don't worry about making any diagnosis when children are too young, but what we do say is that it's important sometime, or I say, for children to have a nice balance between head, heart, and body. So what I do with children, and I'd like to share it with you, is I've made a little game for them. I do this in therapy because I see lots of children who refuse to go to Zoom school. So I'll say, can you see my little brain? Can you see this is a brain? This is the head and this is the neck. This is the brain. And in the brain, there are 3 parts to all our brains. And you can do this, by the way, for your children. So there is the body brain, and this is over here. And we call that, by the way, that's true. That's the part of the brain that really, I'm doing it very simply. This is from Daniel Siegel, by the way. He's got a lovely TED talk and a lovely book. And this part, the body brain, it regulates our breathing, it regulates our heart rate, etc. And this I've called the body brain. This, we could say, is, or the brain stem. This is the limbic system. So it's totally backed by research. And this limbic system is the feelings brain. And that regulates how we feel about things. And then this is called the thinking brain. And this is what school's about. It's about our thinking brain. And the thing is that we have to, all our brains go like this all day and all the time. And school wants us to use our thinking brain, but we've got to use all parts of our brain, our body brain. So to maybe do a physical exercise with our children before Zoom starts. And I love the 5 senses exercise, which is kind of stop, take a look around, and choose something you see, something you hear, something you taste, something you can touch, and something you can, can't remember the last one, smell. So you ask them to do all the 5 senses. So we use, or to stretch, something that uses the body. And then we say, okay, now let's do a temperature test. How are you feeling? Let's see if it's a smiley or whatever it is. In fact, with clients, we've made some other feeling faces. This is sad brain. Actually, yeah, that's one child's sad brain. And this one was another child's sad brain. And then there was somebody else who said he's got confused brain, which was also really sweet. And then there was somebody else that kind of loses a bit of focus, and she has a imaginative brain. So you can kind of help children to be able to become aware of their avoidance response and to use different parts of the development of self in order to overcome some of those difficulties. So that would be my suggestion, to use some of Daniel Siegel's stuff to assist children. What I want to also say, though, on that front, is that sometimes children also need a break. So just to be aware of that. Okay, question number 2, how do I cope with my child's anxiety about leaving home? And this is something that's come up a lot. Children have been home for a long time, school is starting, and they're anxious about it. I think this we call, the solution to this might be what's called systematic desensitization, where we take children for a little bit out the house at a time and see that they survive, you survive, and tomorrow's another day. In fact, children in Singapore have been in touch with 1 or 2 families there, and they've been doing this quite a bit because the children have been at home literally since like beginning of February. So this has become quite an issue, and they've been going to places that are quiet so children get a sense of how to manage, how to be out the house without being too anxious. So it's exposure in small doses. And then the next question, how do I cope with my daughter's rage that her younger sister is returning to school, but she isn't returning to school? So these are all real questions. They're not ones that I've actually made up. So of course, this type of thing could evoke tremendous amount of sibling rivalry. And in South Africa, and I think it's in UK as well, year one is returning, but you might have a year one child, but then you've also got a grade 4 child or a child that's older, that's not returning and that would love to be back at school with friends. So I think what's important here again is to use the art of parenting, to acknowledge children's difficult feelings. We as parents often assume that children are not supposed to have difficult feelings, or we don't want them to have difficult feelings. And let's face it, as parents, we are often trying to fix things. If our child has a temperature or has hurt themselves, we take them to the doctor. We try to fix things. But when it comes to feelings, it's a little bit different. Our job as parents is to hold their difficult feelings, to use the art of parenting to provide that reverie, rather than to just solve their problem and to dismiss their feelings. So I think it's okay for children to have anger. It's not okay to beat up your sister, and it's not okay to throw things around the room, but it's certainly okay to have some angry feelings. And maybe what you can do here is sit down with your daughter and say, let's talk about how the Cohens manage anger in this family. Let's have some strategies. And then think about it. What do you do when you're angry? What would you like your children to do when they are angry? So that kind of discussion can be had. Next question, number 4. What if my child has separation anxiety and we're not allowed onto the school campus? So some children have had this for a while already. They've struggled to say goodbye. So I think here it's important to answer the question or ask the question, what's the goal of my child's behavior? Sometimes that the goal is the point of separation is particularly hard. They want to go to school, but they don't want to say goodbye. And if that's the goal in the separation anxiety, which is quite common, then make it quick. It also might help to give your child something to take and to hold on to while you're not there. Children, especially young children, haven't developed, as I said before, that solid sense of an internal mommy and daddy. So if you think to yourself as an adult that I'm going to buy my mom or my dad a present for their birthday, you'll think about a couple of things that you could get because you've got a picture inside your mind of who your mom or your dad is. Children are still developing that. They don't have it firmly in their own minds. And the younger they are, the harder it is. So sometimes if you give them something that belongs to you, they have the capacity to hold on to you even when they can't see you. So this is a nice option. And of course, I don't know why, but children kind of think you'll come back to fetch the object, but what about, but not them? I don't know where they get that from, but anyway, it's interesting always to notice. Okay, moving on to another 3 questions. Why is my child's behavior so erratic? And this is a very common presentation of children. I think our lives are erratic at the moment. I'm not sure how it is exactly in the UK, but we've had lots and lots of changes. There's lots of mixed messages, I would say. We can go to the shops, but it's not a good idea to go to the shops. We can exercise, but we can't touch anything. We can, there's so many mixed messages, and I think that children don't do well with mixed messages. As I said before, they need rhythm, they need routine. Actually, your Rebbitzin said that, not me, but rhythm, routine is what they need. It's absolutely right. But they find it difficult when there's a mixed message in some of the experience as well. Then they get a sense of helplessness, and that helplessness evokes a sense of lack of control, and then they sometimes act that out. So I think that that's the nature of erratic behavior. If we can establish rhythm and routine, it's helpful in families when everybody gets hungry at a similar time, dirty at a similar time, tired at a similar time. That would be good in order to provide some stability and consistency in our family life. Next question. My child has been diagnosed with ADHD. Should I continue to give him or her medication for home online learning? This has been quite a common question. I'm not actually in a position to answer it because I'm not a pediatric psychiatrist. However, I do work with many pediatric psychiatrists, and my consultations with them, with those colleagues, has been that actually we shouldn't stop children's medication, because even online homeschooling requires an element of focus, and we don't want children to then miss some of the important work that is being offered, and also then to end up with a lowered self-esteem because they're not feeling like they're able to do what others are expecting them to do. So if children are diagnosed and are medicated, even if they're not in a classroom environment, the general view is to be able to continue with the meds, but each person will need to get that direct information from their own doctor. And the last question is, how much should I share with my child about what's going on around us? And I think this is actually, I thought this might be a question that's expired because it kind of came up in the very beginning. But I think it's coming up again, especially because children are going back to school and anxieties are a bit more high. So in South Africa, our numbers are still rising. So I think that that's also something, you know, I know there's some South African listeners, so I wanted to add that. And I also feel like any change will create, again, loss and gain. It will create some anxiety. And we need to be a little careful about what we share and what we also don't share. Sometimes not sharing creates a sense of secrets. And one of the things that I remember from being the director of Kids Safe SA, which is child abuse prevention program in the Jewish community, is that there's one thing that we need to avoid at all costs, and that's secrets. Safe secrets are fine, like we're buying daddy a present for his birthday, don't tell him what it is. That's absolutely fine. But when we're quiet about something and we secretly cover things up, what we're doing is we're creating quite a lot of distress for children. They are self-centered and egocentric, and they often think, what's wrong with me? What's going on? Something's wrong with me. And that's very, very damaging, because obviously any secrets about COVID or about what's going on in the world around them is not often about them. It impacts on them, but it's not about them directly. So I think that we must be careful not to engage in any secrets, but at the same time, we can be careful about what we spoke about and what we say and what we don't, and be measured about it, be thoughtful. Okay, so that was really all that I had to share with you. I'd love you to follow me on Facebook or Instagram, but I'd even love it more if you'd ask some questions if you wish. If you'd like me to explain anything that needed explanation, I hand over to Rebitson Zobin.
Well, thank you. That was really clear, balanced, and very informative. You managed to balance the depth of understanding with some take-home skills and messages. So thank you very much. The recording will be available at some stage. I can send it to you at that point, so you can forward to whoever would like it. Otherwise, it'll be on our website, naisrael.co.uk. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.